Born from the ashes of the cataclysmic reign of blood, the Storm Heralds have fought the enemies of the Emperor with faith and purity over 5 millennia. Following the teachings of their Primarch Robute Guilliman, they fought to preserve the divine right of man to rule the galaxy against the endless tide of darkness. Origins. The origins of the Storm Heralds chapter lie in the wake of the Age of Apostasy, when the insane megalomaniac Gog Vandir seized control of the ecclesiarchy, plunging the Empire of Man into an era of strife and discord. Eventually, after decades of anarchy, he was defeated, and the new ecclesiarch, the popular hero Sebastian Thor, took control of the interstellar church. For, as history records, he retained the sororitas sister Avaroth to serve as his chamber militant. This deeply unsettled the newly reinstituted High Lords of Terra. Thus, they began to establish their own means to check the power of the imperial cult. The most important of these was the formation of the Ordo Hereticus, to watch for doctrinal and genetic heresies. However, as radical as this was, the High Lords still felt they needed a more direct method of exerting imperial power. Thus, the 22nd founding of the Adeptus Astartes was declared. As the new chapters were readied, worlds situated near the key ecclesiarchy strongholds were selected to serve as their homeworlds. This meant that the nascent chapters could guard weakened imperial sectors against invasion and succession, as well as provide a physical reminder of the imperial might to the still resentful cardinals. The 22nd founding lasted for over a century, and by the time the last of the new chapters was ready, new centers of industry and holy significance had emerged. Thus, it was that the new chapter was assigned to a region in Segmentum Tempestus known as the St. Carol Trail. This region is a site of holy significance based upon the extensive pilgrimages of St. Carol, one of the Imperium's most venerable saints. The St. Carol Trail comprises several hundred worlds, stretched across almost 2,000 light-years, and it has become part of the even greater pilgrim trail that runs from Ophelia 7 to Sacred Terra itself. The youthful Space Marine chapter was primarily charged with ensuring the security of the St. Carol Trail as an imperial province and taking the name Storm Heralds. They set to this role with relish. Throughout the next several centuries, the Astartes of the Storm Heralds prosecuted a punishing series of wars against a wide variety of rebellions, successions, chaos uprisings, and various Xenos invasions. However, the chapter's most defining event can be found within its Litany of Honor, portions of which are recited to the Battle Brothers on holy days. Some 300 years after their founding, the Storm Heralds' patrols noticed a marked increase in piracy throughout their domains. Opportunistic raiders had long plagued the pilgrim convoys, but these pirates struck with unerring accuracy, evading naval patrols at every turn. The raids were given little notice by the masters of the chapter, who deemed them a matter for the Imperial Navy. However, this was soon followed by a wave of insurrections and revolutions throughout the sector. The Storm Heralds responded with commendable speed and dispatched forces to put down these rebellions. Unfortunately, they underestimated the scope of the campaign. For each world they restored to order, 3 more would spark into heresy. Soon the chapter was spread throughout the entire St. Carol Trail, desperately overcommitted, and all the while the pillaging of the Pilgrim Trail went unabated. It soon became obvious this heresy was being orchestrated by a wider conspiracy, but there were no clues apparent and none knew where to seek them. However, one man thought differently, the Storm Herald's Master of Sanctity, High Chaplain Chariel. Whilst meditating upon the solutions to the crisis, he received a vision from the Emperor, commanding the chapter to set out across the stars. He immediately brought this vision before the Masters, but was met only with scorn, doubts, and accusations of warp taint. Still, a Master of Sanctity is no man to cross, so the chapter granted him a single squad of devout brothers and an escort frigate to pursue his vision. And so they did, disappearing into the ether for over a decade. They chased across the stars after a foe only they could see. For 8 years, the St. Carol Trail seethed with heresy. Cessation followed rebellion as surely as rebellion followed insurrection, and the touch of the warp began to seep into the region. World after world felt the tread of demons, and the Battle Brothers fought endless wars against chaos. On more than 300 worlds, brave heroes laid down their lives to preserve the divine rule of the Emperor, but it was not enough. As chaos grew in ascendancy, the Storm Heralds were called upon several times to enact the Exterminatus, burning the taint from the stars. Meanwhile, the pillaging and looting of the Emperor's faithful pilgrims only grew and grew in numbers and daring. No one could find the pirates, let alone bring them to battle. Whole fleets chased shadows across the void, only to return and find their home ports had been consumed by heresy and treason. Imperial rule teetered on the brink and seemed certain to fall. Then, after almost a decade of silence, High Chaplain Chariel returned from the void with a tale of heresy and betrayal. For 8 years, his brethren had hunted the pirates, plaguing the Pilgrim Trail to no avail. But then, guided by inspiration provided by the Emperor's benevolence, they had stalked the Imperial Navy patrols instead. Shockingly, they had discovered an official Navy way station in deep space. Here, the patrols had encountered pirates, but instead of following their duty, they had met to parley. Chariel had witnessed wealth, slaves, arms, supplies, and intelligence being exchanged, and realized the damning extent of the conspiracy. It was no wonder the Navy could not prosecute the pirates, for it was the very Admiralty itself that sponsored them. The wealth they stole had been channeled into hundreds of minor cults across the sector, funding their insurrections, and the entire St. Carol Trail had suffered under their evil. When confronted with the facts, the masters and captains of the Storm Heralds repented their hubris. How much suffering could have been avoided had they heeded the Emperor's visions. They donned sackcloths and ashes for the month, whilst the Battle Brothers spearheaded an Inquisition strike against dozens of naval bases. Soon, a mountain of evidence had stacked up against the highest levels of Admiralty, many cardinals, planetary governors, and other high-ranking imperial officials. The Ordo Hereticus was zealous and unforgiving in their prosecution of these heretics. Corrupt households were gathered up to the last scullery maid and executed, while whole bloodlines of powerful families were purged from the galaxy. And at every purge, the Storm Heralds stood ready to enact the High Lord's will, never hesitating to bring the judgment of terror down upon those who had turned from the Emperor's holy light. Surely many who died were innocent, but that mattered not to the rulers of Hera, and within 2 years every single traitor had been purged or fled. With order finally restored to the region, the Storm Heralds returned to their homeworld and swore never to allow such heresy to threaten the Emperor's faithful again. They vowed to forever guarantee the security of the holiest shrines and safeguard the pilgrim trails against any who challenged the Emperor's divine rule. For 5,000 years since, heretics and blasphemous traitors have sought to smother the benevolence and wisdom that the Imperium offers, but the Storm Herald's credo is clear. Any that resist enlightenment must be eradicated without mercy. And so the Emperor's divine rule is preserved. Homeworld. The planet of Lujan II is a small, geologically active world, rich in life with a single solitary moon, much reminiscent of the ancient Terra itself. However, Lujan II is notable for its slow rotation, approximately 21.5 Terran standard days, and being over 95% ocean, the little land present is comprised of 3 small island continents and tens of thousands of tiny volcanic islands. The planet exports its vast, deep-sea Promethean oil reserves and its abundant riches of marine life to nearby worlds. However, the greatest source of wealth for Lujan II comes from the scores of pilgrim ships that every year traverses the St. Carol Trail. The dilapidated and overcrowded ships must negotiate thousands of light years in their pilgrimages, and in doing so they face terrible dangers: warp storms, rogue stellar bodies, technical failures, disease, and starvation all plague the penitents on their journey, but the most common danger of all is that of heretical piracy. The St. Carol Trail lies far from the centres of Imperium power and is a tiny ribbon of civilization in the endless tracts of wilderness space. For every system the Imperium can patrol, there are 100 more where pirates can lurk with impunity. Thus, it is only through constant vigilance that the Storm Herald's fleet can ensure the security of the region that the chapter has been charged with protecting. Across centuries, the Storm Heralds have policed their domains ruthlessly, holding true to the ancient oaths and duties that bind their chapter to this day. The Astartes show no mercy whatsoever to any ship they encounter trying to hunt the slow convoys, and it is a brave or reckless captain indeed whom attempts to encroach upon their domains. Thus, Lujan II has become a vital port on the long pilgrim voyages, an ideal place to rest, refit and repair in safety before pressing onwards with their journey. To cope with the demands of the convoys, the Adeptus Mechanicus has established an ample network of orbital docks and spaceports over Lujan II to service the pilgrim ships, bringing relief to the thousands and fabulous wealth to the planetary governor. Such a trade monopoly inevitably invites corruption and heresy, but after a pilgrimage by the Storm Herald's chaplains to the governor's palace, a significant portion of his fortune was immediately invested back into developing the planet's infrastructure. Though the chapter complies with the Codex Astartes policy of refusing to take direct control of planetary governments, their watchful influence has resulted in Lujan II boasting of one of the most productive, devout, and stable societies. The majority of the limited dry land on the planet is given over to the nobles' estates, spaceports, and Mechanicus forges, whose workshops and factories labour to produce parts and equipment for the shipyards in orbit. However, the bulk of the population either lives among the coastlines or on the countless tiny islands, spending their lives fishing and operating the deep-sea drilling platforms and tanker ships. A life upon the ocean wave breeds men tough and strong, teaching the values of loyalty and obedience while weeding out weakness and mutation. Although they lack the killer instinct favoured by the majority of Astartes chapters, they remain a strong and stable source of recruits for the chapter. The finest of these young men compete for a place in the chapter at an annual series of challenges and trials staged at various locations across the planet by the Storm Herald's chaplains. The fortress monastery of the Storm Herald itself covers a single solitary island peak, located several hundred miles into a vast, empty ocean where few sailors would dare go. Ancient texts claim that the fortress was originally very plain and functional, but thousands of years of artistic labour have turned it into one of the most breathtaking sights in the subsector. Indeed, many pilgrims come down from orbit to meditate and pray beneath its soaring spires. The masters of the chapter do not encourage such visits. However, the local cardinal has secured an agreement with the chaplains to tolerate brief pilgrimages. Exactly what the chapter was promised for this privilege is a matter that the Inquisition is vigorously investigating. The Emperor's Storm. The one truly unique and bizarre feature of Lujan II is that it has no discernible weather patterns. Instead, it suffers a permanent and fixed ring of narrow hurricane storms encircling the entire globe from pole to pole. No savant or tech priest has ever successfully explained this phenomenon, but it usually is attributed to the planet's slow rotation, leading to a severe temperature difference between day and night. However, whatever the reason, these typhoons move across the globe at exactly the same rate as the rotation, meaning that there is a perpetual hurricane hovering on the terminus between day and night. As might be expected in the superstitious Imperium, these cyclones have taken on supernatural attributes to the locals. A fierce belief has arisen that the storms are the manifestation of the Emperor's will and that they winnow the pure from the corrupt. Multiple convoluted household rituals have developed to appease the Emperor, but strangely the population do not fear the storm so much as embrace it. It is regarded as a purifying force, safeguarding the life-giving dawn from the evils of night and chaos. People believe it is the most holy rite to sail successfully through the tempests, and it is seen as the ultimate test of a man's moral courage to face the storms without sailing for home. And for those adepts who huddle inside their well-built homes on the mainland, the people regard them with distrust, seeing them as weak, decadent, and immoral. The Storm Heralds have adopted the hurricanes as their namesakes, and every sunrise they stand upon their battlements to face the whirlwind. Together, every brother currently stationed on the planet stands before the hurricane, letting its fury test their purity and winnow away corruption and sin. Any brother who slips or stumbles in the unleashed fury of the storm are seen to have allowed impurity into their souls and are immediately removed from the battle roster. They are sent before the chaplains, apothecaries and librarians for shrivening and chastisement until the masters are satisfied that their impurity has been burned out. Combat Doctrine. In all combat situations, the Storm Herald's chapter adheres rigidly to the precepts laid down in the Codex Astartes, and they present a balanced, flexible force able to take on any known enemy. In the vast wastes of the Segmentum Tempestus, their deeds have oft gone unsung, but they have faced countless alien threats, the dire forces of chaos, as well as pirates and reavers beyond counting. However, the Storm Heralds have shown the most zeal when battling heretics, blasphemers, and rebels, those that seek to lure the faithful away from the Emperor's guiding light. The Storm Heralds show no mercy to these heretics, and their involvement in putting down rebellions has been harsh, brutal, and indiscriminate. However, the Ordo Hereticus has observed a disturbing divergence from the Codex Astartes when the Storm Heralds chapter is not actively engaged in battle. There exist authenticated documents, some dating back to the mid-M39s, of campaigns against heretic worlds where the Storm Heralds have not immediately departed upon completion of hostilities. Instead, it has been verified that the Battle Brothers delay their embarking and travel amongst the general populace. They travel in small groups, preaching to the people, and bring thousands back into the Imperial fold in every city. By the time the Space Marines depart, a significant fraction of the population will have been converted and will be eagerly awaiting the return of the Imperium and its purges of those who refuse to embrace the Emperor. This practice has deeply disturbed many in the Inquisition, leading to whispers circulating behind closed doors of similarities to the traitorous Word-Bearers' practices. The Storm Heralds have never attempted to translate this practice into any military, economic, or political power, and it is this fact alone that has spared them from the ire of the Inquisition. Though worlds converted by the Storm Heralds are noted for having highly devout and loyal societies, the Inquisition still routinely conducts deep investigations into their governments. As yet, no evidence has emerged that any sort of conspiracy is being orchestrated. However, should there ever be any found, the consequences would be catastrophic for the chapter. Over the last century, certain factions within the Inquisition have approached several other chapters on the matter of the Storm Herald's deviant practices. This includes the famed Ultramarines master Marneus Calgar, who denounced their practices as incompatible with the Codex Astartes. Other Astartes chapters who have been informed of Marneus Calgar's censure have since begun to refuse to fight alongside Storm Herald companies. The High Lords of Terror themselves have issued a severe reprimand to the chapter, and local authorities have interpreted this as permission to stem the supply of munitions and equipment they receive from the Forge Worlds. Though Imperial bureaucracy is notoriously slow, It is now almost certain that the Storm Heralds chapter will soon find itself at odds with the very empire it exists to serve. The Purging of the Angel's Landing. In 985.M41, the small agri-world of Angel's Landing fell into cessation and heresy. The governor, Brendan the Mad, led a rebellion against the divine rule of the emperor, using his private armies of thugs to murder all imperial personnel. Over the next few months, the governor had the people craft a series of idols in his own image, establishing them throughout the major population centres. Governor Brendan declared himself the new god of Angel's Landing and forced all citizens to prostrate themselves before his idols and worship him. Any who hesitated were clubbed down and dragged away by his thug armies. Soon, thousands had been taken to concentration camps to suffer hideous deprivations. However, by this time, the Imperium had become aware of this cessation, and a task force was dispatched to put down the rebellion. The task force consisted of an Imperial cruiser, a half-dozen Imperial Guard regiments, and a battle barge of Storm Heralds chapter, the Light of Terror, bearing 2 whole companies of Astartes. The fleet reached Angel's Landing some 18 weeks after the rebellion had broken out, and immediately launched their attack. The mighty battle barge made short work of the orbital defense platforms, and the Storm Heralds spearheaded a full-scale invasion. The resulting war was brutal and swift, with the battle-hardened Imperial forces easily scattering Governor Brendan's thug armies and crushing all opposition. Within 22 days, the governor's palace was completely besieged, and 5 days later it fell to the Imperium. The leaders of this rebellion were purged by the Inquisition, who were ruthless and merciless with these heretics. By the end of their investigation, hundreds had been burned at the stake. Only the lowest guards and servants were spared, shipped off to spend the rest of their brief lives fighting in penal legions as penance for their hubris. The Imperium immediately set about restoring order, establishing garrisons at the spaceports, strategic bases, and liberating the pitiful survivors of the concentration camps. The tenets of the Codex Astartes would at this point have considered the Space Marines' tasks complete. However, unlike most chapters, the Storm Heralds did not depart for new crises. Instead, the 200 Astartes scattered across the continents. Travelling alone, each Marine undertook a pilgrimage through the towns and villages. Everywhere they went, the Marines preached to the masses, telling them that they had strayed into darkness and forfeited the light of the Emperor. Under their guidance, many fell into vast displays of penance and self-flagellation, seeking to purge themselves of their sins, but this was insufficient to appease the Storm Heralds. They told the people that only by burning out the most wicked and unrepentant among their number could they purify themselves enough to earn the Emperor's forgiveness. Incited by the Space Marines and terrified of their wrath, the population turned upon itself. Fanatical mobs falling upon their friends and relatives at the slightest whisper of collaboration. Neighbours denounced each other for the smallest transgressions, and vast pyres burned with thousands at the stake. Doubtless, many of those who died were innocent, but to the Storm Heralds, each man owed fealty to the Emperor before any other, and those who worshipped false idols must be purged. After only 40 days, the violence had swept through every population centre. More people had died in the purge than had done so in the rebellion, and now the survivors were ardently pledging their allegiance to the Emperor. At this point, the Storm Heralds declared themselves satisfied with the compliance of Angel's Landing and departed to partake in the Fornax Gulf Crusade. The actions of the Storm Heralds at Angel's Landing have galvanized the normally feuding imperial institutions and united them in condemnation, a nearly unprecedented event in the 41st millennium. The loudest criticism of all came from the cardinals of the ecclesiarchy, who protested the Storm Heralds' commandeering of their divine jurisdiction. Multiple reprimands have been issued criticizing the Storm Herald's actions as dangerously exceeding the mandate of the Adeptus Astartes. Steps have also been taken to isolate the chapter from its sources of supply, and now the Storm Herald's chapter finds itself struggling to support its companies in the field. Organization. The Storm Herald's chapter holds mostly to the Codex pattern, with all 10 of its companies being standard in size and composition. But there are two notable divergences from the Codex. Firstly, the chapter's Apothecarian is much larger than normal and carries much more authority. So much so that they have even been seen leading units in the field. Also, the chapter regularly sends its apothecaries out to serve with the Inquisitorial Death Watch, an extremely rare duty in the Imperium for such skilled specialists. The Ordo Hereticus has recently called upon the Ordo Xenos to disbar the Storm Heralds from their chamber militant. No official response has been forthcoming, but it is notable that no Brothers of the Storm Heralds has been called upon to serve in the Death Watch for 20 years. Secondly, the chapter maintains an extensive fleet of reclaimed Corsair frigates and armed merchantmen, alongside its nominal fleet assets. The official position of the Storm Heralds is that the easy pickings of the dilapidated pilgrim ships that run through the St. Carol Trail draws pirates and alien raiders like moths to the flame. To police the trail across 2,000 light-years is impossible, even for the vast Imperial Navy, so the Storm Heralds maintain that an expanded fleet of small, fast vessels is the only way to ensure the security of their assigned domains. However, despite displaying this willingness to assist the Navy, many fleet admirals remain aloof and unwilling to cooperate with the chapter. Given the violent history between the two organizations, this is quite understandable. Unfortunately, maintaining such a large fleet creates headaches all of its own. Firstly, the demand for Space Marine Command crews is much higher, necessitating an entire company be dedicated to the task. Rather than permanently taking 100 Marines out of action, the chapter has instead increased its recruitment drive, in effect creating an 11th company. This is counted as a reserve company, and Marines are regularly rotated out to protect against over-specialization. Regrettably, the demands of the fleet leaves the Tech Marines with very little time to waste on exotic technologies, and they are hard-pressed to maintain the chapter at full fighting strength. When this is combined with the Storm Herald's lack of support from the Imperium, it means that the chapter struggles to field Terminator squads, and many honoured dreadnoughts languish in stasis, futilely awaiting proper maintenance. Chapter Master Gorgle. Chapter Master Gorgle is a stout and hearty warrior, dour by nature and well versed in the arts of war. For 300 years he has marched across the stars, leading his men to war and spreading the word of the Emperor to countless heathen planets. Unlike many chapter masters, he knows humility as well as valor, and he often seeks out other imperial institutions to offer his aid in battle. Sadly, the stock of goodwill generated by his open-handed behavior has been wasted by the current feud between the chapter and the Imperium at large. Many companies have arrived at war zones to find their aid rebuffed, and entreaties to other chapters have been only met with threats of violence. Worst of all, word has reached his ears that plans have been made to gather forces to blockade his world, and even the advice of the Grey Knights has been sought. Only the massive reinforcements needed for the Armageddon campaign and the 13th Black Crusade have postponed these plans for the moment. The Storm Heralds now face an impossible choice: abandon their devotion to the Emperor or abandon the Imperium altogether. It will certainly prove the greatest challenge of Master Gorgle's career as to how he deals with this situation. Gene Seed. Being founded from the stock of Rabute Gulliman, the Storm Herald's gene seed is notably pure and fecund. However, over the past several millennia, it has become apparent that the chapter suffers from a defective cataplesian node. Whether this originates from an environmental factor or is due to degeneration in the chapter's surgical practices is unclear. Whatever the cause, it is known that prolonged use of their cataplesian nodes can cause the Battle Brothers to suffer severe chemical imbalances within the brain, resulting in vivid hallucinations and prophetic visions. There seems to be a clear relationship between the length of time the node is used and the frequency and vividness of the hallucinations. In field operations, this can hamper the Storm Heralds as, unlike other chapters, they must factor in a minimum sleep period of 4 hours every 7 days, or risk fighting with degraded tactical capabilities. However, overall, the Storm Heralds themselves do not seem to consider this defect a liability, as they have embraced these visions as cryptic proclamations of the Emperor's will, thus believing them to be divine. This belief has even led to chapter rituals extending to the partaking of noxious vapors and chemical hallucinogens to deliberately trigger these visions. This practice is a source of some contention with the Order Hereticus, but nevertheless, the brothers continue, and it is the duty of the chapter's librarians to witness, document, and interpret every single vision, no matter how bizarre. It has been known for the chapter's commitment of resources to be dependent upon these vision quests, and occasionally entire missions will be sent out based upon nothing more than a series of visions and a belief in the Emperor's infallible will. Lessel, Master of the Apothecarian. Master Apothecary Lessel is by far the oldest and perhaps most influential member of the Storm Heralds chapter. Even the most venerable masters of the chapter cannot remember a time when his stern gaze was not watching over them, and not one amongst them can rival his fanatical devotion to the Golden Throne. He demands nothing less than perfection from those who serve under him in the Apothecarian, and it is largely thanks to the efforts of men like him that the Storm Herald's gene seed remains pure and stable. His influence in the highest levels of command is unrivaled, and when the chapter master plans his campaigns, it is always Lessel who honestly tells him how steep the price will be. When Lessel was but a young apothecary, he served in the Inquisitorial Death Watch, and after many years he returned battered and scarred. Of the dark deeds he undertook in those times, he will not speak. But his eyes are yet haunted by the horrors he witnessed, and he retains a bitter hatred for all agents of the Inquisition and the Imperium at large. For 5 centuries since, Lessel has watched his brothers march to war and then put them back together again when they are carried home. Many times on the field of battle, he has comforted a dying Space Marine whom he himself once inducted into the chapter, and every life lost only hardens his bitterness towards the galaxy. Sadly, in this time of crisis, Lessel's voice is the loudest of all, pushing the Storm Heralds into conflict with the Imperium. Lessel has come to firmly believe that the root cause of the Imperium's decline is the weak rule of the High Lords. He speaks often that the Space Marines would do a far better job of leading humanity in these dark times than the corrupt and diffident High Lords. In the chapter, some start to doubt the soundness of his words and say the time has finally come for when he should be retired from active service. Meanwhile, others decry any slur against his wisdom. This polarization in their beliefs could well mean the Storm Heralds will soon face an internal crisis as great as the one currently raging outside their walls. Beliefs. The Storm Heralds believe that the Emperor entrusted them with certain principles that must be upheld at all costs. Loyalty, integrity, humble service, and the protection of the Emperor's realm. The chapter holds itself first and foremost to be the champions and defenders of mankind. They believe that it is their duty to protect and fight for the men and women of the Imperium, and they disdain any strategy that calls for the sacrifice of civilian lives to preserve their own. That being said, they can, on rare occasion, act with chilling ruthlessness and brutality. They will not suffer any hint of chaos taint to exist, nor will they tolerate any insurrection against the rule of the Imperium. The chapter also thinks nothing of devastating rebellious populations, even when some may merely be following one lone heretic leader. This may seem to be a contradiction, but the Storm Heralds draw a line between those they consider innocents and heretics. One is to be protected at all costs, and the other is to be eradicated without mercy. As with all chapters, the Storm Heralds revere their Primarch, Rabute Guilliman, and their adoration of his teaching is fierce indeed. Over time, the Storm Heralds have also displayed a shift towards outright Emperor worship, but whether this comes from their prolonged contact with the Pilgrim convoys or their own initiative is unclear. Unfortunately, these two icons of their devotion have created a divergence in the ranks. Those who cling to the Primarch as their primary locus of faith hold to the teachings of the Codex, believing they should seek martial excellence and leave the running of the Imperium to the civil authorities. Set against them are those who worship the Emperor as a divine being and hold that, as his favoured sons, this gives them the authority to do as they will, regardless of the High Lord's opinion on the matter. It is unknown where their practice of preaching to conquered worlds originates, but now this deviant behaviour has come into the open. It has led to a great conflict between Storm Heralds and their allies. How the chapter will respond to this crisis is unclear, but it is certain that this practice will not be tolerated for long. Until recently, many held that given the current threats the Imperium faces, it can ill afford to start another Badab war. However, the belief growing in the corridors of power is that before much longer the Imperium won't be able to afford not to. Now, the proud traditions and indeed the very fate of the chapter itself rest in the hands of one man, Chapter Master Gorgle. How he deals with the crisis will determine the future of every brother of the Storm Heralds. Battle Cry. Chaplains. We are the Emperor's storm. Brethren, we are his wrath. Angle's Redoubt. In the last years of the 41st millennium, the Imperium was racked by terrible wars, the Tyranid invasions, the War for Armageddon, and most horribly, the 13th Black Crusade. Being located in the galactic south, deep in the Segmentum Tempestus, the Storm Heralds could do little to confront these foes. Instead, they were forced to contend themselves with protecting supply lines, ensuring the desperately needed materials and equipment could get to the front lines. These humble and often overlooked duties are vital tasks, for without adequate supplies, Imperial resistance would have withered away to nothing. However, it still galled the Space Marines to be so far from the glory of battle. However, in 995 M41, all that changed when a small splinter fleet from Hive Fleet Leviathan encroached upon the world of Angle's Redoubt. Located a mere 120 light-years from the chapter's homeworld, Angle's Redoubt was a mighty hive world and linchpin of Imperial power in the region. Its massive manufactories produced endless lines of weapons and munitions, and the planet supported a population of 19 billion. Inquisitorial reports stated that the general populace was happy, productive, and loyal. Indeed, regiments from its world had battled against the Tyranids before earning many posthumous battle honours. The masters of the Storm Heralds deliberated the coming of the Tyranids to Angle's Redoubt and agreed that such a holy world could never be allowed to fall to the hunger of the hive mind. The decision was unanimous, and for only the second time in its history, the entire chapter was committed to one battle. The brothers setting sail that very day. Many claim that the Emperor was watching over them on this voyage, for though their passage was turbulent and terrifying, they still arrived unscathed several days before the shadow of the hive mind engulfed the system. Few of the gathered Lord militants greeted the chapter with any warmth, but the size of the threat was too great to ignore, and the Storm Heralds were reluctantly given permission to deploy. 7 companies of the chapter dropped to the surface immediately to bolster defences and prepare the armies for battle. Meanwhile, Chapter Master Gorgel met with the high command of generals, admirals, governors, cardinals, and inquisitors to plan their strategies. Long had the Imperium studied the Tyranid menace, and at the cost of billions of lives, they had learned how best to meet the foe. When the Tyranid fleet entered their system, their fleet was comprised of thousands of Tyranid escorts and hundreds of Razor-Fiend cruisers, all led by but a single hive ship. The outer planets in the system were completely lifeless, so the Tyranids progressed straight towards the primary biosphere. The vast bulk of the fleet swamped surveyor screens, and no attack could hope to wound the hive mind. Instead, the Imperials allowed the Tyranids to approach the planet unopposed, creating an illusion of vulnerability. But Angle's Redoubt was no helpless victim. As the hive fleet descended to feast, a vast chain of orbital defense stations opened fire. Rolling broadsides and volleys of torpedoes tore deeply into the enemy, and scores of lesser beasts were destroyed in the first 10 minutes. The Tyranids responded with typical ferocity, moving to engage the defense stations. Their horrific beasts charging headlong to tear the stations apart. Corrosive acids, missiles of chitin, and gargantuan rending claws shredded through ancient hulls, and thousands of crewmen were killed. But the heroic men fought on, struggling to reload their guns as fast as they could, determined to make every shot count. The uneven battle could only end one way, but over the course of an hour, the defense stations had greatly wounded the fleet and, more importantly, scattered thousands of lesser beasts across the orbital lanes. With the way open, the vast hive fleet descended once more, braving the torrent of fire from the surface guns to begin dropping mycetic spores on the planet. But in doing so, they spread themselves too thin, and for the first time, the mighty hive ship was left with only a few score escorts. Suddenly, a new force entered the fray from behind the terminus of the planet. A joint task force of the Imperial Navy and the Astartes vessels powered forwards, desperate to seize their one chance. Fleet Admiral Dismanis commanded the Mars-class battle carrier Agamemnon. Supported by the Lunar-class cruiser Avarov, the Dominator-class Kilkis, two Dauntless-class light cruisers, the Spetsai and the Cadmus, there was also the Grand Cruiser Hector, and finally 5 squadrons of escort frigates. Alongside them were 7 Space Marine strike cruisers, another 4 squadrons of Astartes frigates, and both of the Storm Heralds' battle barges, the Light of Terror and the Thunderlord. Determined to avenge their fallen comrades, the Imperial fleet powered forwards, desperate to engage the lone hive ship. A lucky long-range hit from one of Agamemnon's Nova cannons obliterated a Razor-Fiend, and multiple torpedo salvos raced ahead of the fleet. Intended not to hurt the foe, but rather to lure away their protective spore clouds. Hot on their heels raced dozens of Thunderhawks. Burning hard, they bore 3 full companies into the very heart of the hive fleet. With their cover lured away, the Tyranids were exposed to the elite Astartes borders, and despite taking horrendous casualties, they managed to cripple 6 Razor-Fiend cruisers. Their tasks complete, the Astartes dropped to the planet below. Their Thunderhawks lacking the fuel to continue fighting, and their skills in desperate need on the surface. Seizing their only chance, the Imperial fleet surged forth and drove straight into the heart of the Tyranid lines, blasting away continuously with every gun until it ran white hot. Scores of Tyranid escorts were annihilated under the weight of fire, but for every one that fell, a dozen surged forth to take its place. 4 more Razor-Fiends were bracketed and annihilated in less than 10 minutes, but to this was a drop in the ocean of the Chitin. The Imperials were inflicting heavy damage on the foe, but their pace was slowing, and they had yet to touch the hive ship. Imperial fighters danced and pinwheeled around the ships, desperately trying to destroy the fleshy boarding pods streaming out of the Tyranid vessels, but there were too many to deny. One by one, the Imperial vessels were boarded by hideous creatures too loathsome to describe. The fleet's pace slowed as crews were diverted to combat the enemy, and the ships began taking a pounding. Several escorts and 2 strike cruisers were overrun by wave after wave of horrific abominations. At the very head of the formation, the battle barge, Light of Terror, finally made contact with the hive ship, its mighty guns gouging great tears into the pitted hide. Weathering the storm, the Leviathan vessel spat its feeder tentacles into the Light of Terror's hull, fleshy veins boring through plasteel and adamantium to release thousands of bioengineered killing machines into the battle barge's bowels. With all its companies absent, the Light of Terror was overrun in minutes, and its crew rendered down into biomass for the hive ship to consume. Deck by deck, the mighty vessel succumbed until even the bridge itself was overrun. Overwhelmed by the sheer mass of chitin, the crew were able to send but one single transmission before they were devoured. 3 brief words to stand testament to 8,000 lost souls. Avenge our deaths. Far behind him, on the bridge of the Thunderlord, the order was heard and heeded. Seeing the untouched hive ship gorging itself upon their sister ship, her captain gave the command. "Helm control, give me ramming speed." Plasma drives flaring like captured suns, the Thunderlord surged forth, hurtling through the void towards wrestling pairs of ships. Sensing the incoming threat, the hive ship attempted to move away, but its own feeder tentacles anchored it to the mighty battle barge, and it could not come about. Hitting the hive ship, the Thunderlord's adamantium prow tore through the pitted hide with ease, and in mere moments the battle barge had crippled the hive ship. Unable to stop, the battered Thunderlord careened forwards, whilst behind it the hive ship spun in agony, spilling blood and ichor into the void. Fleet Admiral Dismanis ordered the Avarov to suppress the few Razor Fiends left so that the Spetsai and Cadmus could engage the hive ship with their lance cannons. Spears of star-hot lance beams punched through the spore clouds and burned into the foe. They instantly cut through its torn hide and began incinerating massive organs and blood vessels. A diffused cloud vomited forth from the hive ship's belly, comprised of the bodies of millions of lesser tyrannid beasts. They kicked and struggled in the void, but were as doomed as their loathsome parent. Blast after blast tore into its vitals until finally the hive ship gave one last mighty shudder and died. The Tyrannid fleet instantly lost all coordination and scattered in all directions, fleeing mindlessly into the void. Many Imperial vessels had been crippled in the fighting, but those strike cruisers that were able gave pursuit, and it is estimated that fully 2/3 of the Tyrannid ships were obliterated before they could scatter into deep space. The Imperials had won the day, but the war was not over. Many ships had been gutted, and it would take years to rebuild them. But worst of all, vast swarms had descended to the planet itself. The resulting conflict raged on for another 10 months, with hundreds of thousands dying in the fighting. Millions more died of starvation and disease. But for all the ferocity, the Tyranids could never effectively rebuild their overmind without the hive ship. Though vastly outnumbered, the Imperials were able to bring their entire might to bear against each swarm in turn, and by the end of the year, the populace celebrated their victory. After the war, the hulk of the Light of Terror had been cleansed deck by the Storm Heralds, who themselves had lost 350 Space Marines in the war against the Tyranids. Yet the price of their deaths was high and of undisputable worth, for without their heroism, Angle's redoubt would surely have fallen. The billions of faithful Imperial citizens who lived because of the sacrifices made by these Marines are a fine testament to their valor.